to another disc guidance segment with the 2MK team. Today we are looking at another form of our Dragon Ball FighterZ bot. Today, one of the easier ones that you can use to get used to converting some damage off of certain situations, and to help you get back if you were the sort of person that gave up on super dashing because the opponent got too good at stopping you. There are still times when one needs this skill, and applying it correctly can take some getting used to, especially when faced with opponents at higher levels who will position themselves for it or just have really good reactions and will knock you out of it in some way. Today, therefore, we are showing off the 3 characters we'll be using for this, and some bot settings required for getting this particular one correct. So I'll let this run while I explain the gauge settings and some of the action settings, but you can just watch what's going on screen as a whole. Unlike most other bots where the gauge setting is basically your choice, since normally you don't get much points for doing vanishes or big combos, and since you generally don't want to defeat your opponent too early, this would actually be a bad thing for you. You would generally not want to have too much meter and do a bunch of other things to do extra damage, because that would just make your life difficult. In this case, however, we're not actually looking at it that way. So, your meter needs to specifically be set to 0 on your side, and the bot can keep its usual 1 bar of key gauge as its default. In terms of actions, the actions you want to have different than quote-unquote normal are actions 3 and 4 will be at 20 rather than their usual 100, and action 5 in most cases will be off. There is one reason to turn this on, but it's very rare, and we will discuss that later. Just assume that it has to do with specific characters, and if you don't hear your characters mentioned, you have no reason to turn this on. The characters you'll be facing are Tenshinhan, Base Goku if you have the DLC available, he's very good for it. And if you do not have the DLC available, you can use Goku Black, and we will demonstrate his effect later on. So you've seen a little bit of the movement involved in the bot. But let's get into what your actual aims are, and therefore the point system in question. Obviously, this is a relatively easy bot. It's about super dashing. So, your goal is obviously to super dash. But you're not going to get points for just randomly super dashing in neutral. If you want to get points from neutral, hey, I think my opponent is going to do this, and I just want to super dash in on them right now for whatever reason, you must use your change to do it. In other words, call in another character rather than just super dashing yourself from the ground. However, just landing that at all as long as you can get even the smallest of combos, generally you should try not to just hit a special, just to make sure you have the accuracy. But for some characters, even just hitting special is quite enough. It'll make you better at the game as a whole, though, if you try not to just use a special that immediately comes out of it. When your opponent goes into the air for any reason, if you can react in time by super dashing yourself, you can do that super dash from the ground and claim your point. This is often a thing that happens with Super Saiyan Goku at particular timings and spacing, but as a whole, you shouldn't expect that they'll spend a lot of time in the air. With actions 3 and 4 reduced in the amount of chance of them showing up, you're going to get a lot more EX moves, which can be really frustrating in certain ways because of the characters, and a lot less specials and raw movement, meaning that you have to be constantly on guard and watching your opponent's position and spacing. It's a lot like playing neutral, but not quite. And while it is not clear, it's actually fairly hard to get that point of just super dashing at the opponent while they're in the air. However, there is one way to just get points for super dashing. This comes from you going into the air yourself in any way. You can just jump. Usually you're aiming to see if you can avoid a move or read a position or something, and super dash from there. If you want to just do it from full screen, it might work out, but as the bot is now, it should punish you often enough that you would at least learn why it's not a great idea to just go to full screen, jump straight up in the air, and do this. You can definitely retreat from the opponent though if you think it's going to help. And you can watch them as carefully as possible. So with your initial ways of getting points, specifically the super dash from the air and the Z-chain super dash in any way you want, you will get extra points for actually landing your combo to the level where you can do a vanish attack after it. This is part of the reason why you must build up the meter, and you can also do it into level 3 super if you want to use up meter for an extra point. Or you can do something into a Dragon Rush, but the Dragon Rush must be part of the quote-unquote combo. This is often necessary because you're trying to throw the opponent out anyway so you don't defeat them. But it's a little harder than you'd think as a whole because of the way Dragon Rush interacts with normal hits. For the most part, you won't end up doing that much damage to this bot, and you'll quickly learn that things such as super dash combos don't really hurt all that much. You have to be fairly on point to get really good combo damage out of them, especially if you were doing air ones and changed your own vector, or knocking your opponent out of the air and hitting them at basically an odd angle. If you try this for a little bit, it'll become clearer to you why exactly it is that super dashes are not so great an idea as your standard method of play of approach in this game. But you learning to use them, or basically saying, okay, I shouldn't just super dash all the time. I'll wait a little bit and then super dash, isn't actually that easy. It has all sorts of tiny nuances and flaws, and depending on the opposing characters, you can be punished for this. And this is actually what Tenshinhan is meant to demonstrate fairly often. These three characters don't really need to move forward much, but when they do, it's usually very sudden. And they can get a lot of damage off you, whereas you can't necessarily do so much to them. Another way to think about this same situation is the fact that in many pressury or facing situations where the opponent has an advantage, jumping backward into the air is beneficial to you. But sometimes you want to react to this situation by actually responding if your opponent didn't do anything or tried something that wasn't likely to hit you. So jumping back as a retreat method and then choosing to super dash because you see an opportunity is a good option. We've trained this sort of thing a little bit in other forms of the bot. But this is actually intended to be done when the opponent isn't necessarily going to be approaching you. When you just feel you have an opening for whatever reason, let's say that maybe they want to call an assist to catch you or lock you down, but instead of allowing this, you go for the super dash, which changes the situation. The assists in question are also helpful for this reason, therefore. From the change the eye switch side, obviously you can only get points for switching by switching, but switching is on the same timer as calling assists, and therefore you can only get your points that way. This is partly why Goku is so useful for this, as his command grab, along with his ability to throw beams, even though he will seldom do it in this form, and certain forms of good long normals without actually approaching much in any standard way, makes it much more likely that you'll get caught by things while trying to just wiggle around, defend, and similar. It's absolutely in your favor to wait for your moment, and it will often feel as if you could just, okay, I'm just gonna defend until something good happens and then do what I want from there. But unless you eliminate base Goku, which is, again, really not the point here, you won't be able to do this 100% of the time. And that move is really hard to defend against. The only really fair thing about it for a lot of people is that it doesn't do that much damage. He does get some combos after it, but they don't tend to be too devastating in themselves either. In general, as previously mentioned, there is a situation in which you would want to turn on the action 5 of these characters. But this is true only if, and we'll demonstrate it at least a bit here, and we'll show why one generally would not turn it on. It basically causes them all to do a bit too much blasting in ways that are easily defeated by super dashes, and more or less easily reacted to. Similarly, it does not really enhance their ability to keep you out or anything like that at all, meaning that they're mostly just wasting their time. The main time you would want to do this, therefore, is if you play very aerial characters. And even then, it's still not necessarily recommended. There's specific aerial characters for whom this is helpful. Because it's really a question of, do their moves go through things, and if they chose to do super dashes in the same spaces, would it be a bad idea? So while it's on, let's switch to a demo of that a bit. We're going to take two characters who have that set up, specifically Kid Buu and Vegeta Blue, and one who functionally does not, i.e. Bardock. Bardock is not by most standards an aerial character, but he can be played that way, and there's definitely some things you will see that are vastly different. Kid Buu can generally do his super dash from the same spaces on screen that he would launch an attack, and this makes him effective. That is the way to make this decision, for the most part. Is your character able to make an attack and yet have a super dash in that same spacing be a good idea? If not, then turning on Action 5 may be of some use to you. This does not necessarily apply to characters who just don't have good air moves. Not having good moves in the air doesn't really mean that it's a great idea to turn it off either way. But again, it has more to do with how easily you can do it, the timing of the moves, and so on. For example, to some extent Goku Black is actually difficult to do this with, as is Android 18, and to some extent Android 17. But as demonstrated, Kid Buu can mostly attack from the same places he can super dash without too much stress on the player. In fact, he benefits directly from doing so. Which puts us back to effectively what one was doing before with one of our earlier bots, but with the super dash included. With Bardock, however, the situation shifts a lot. Bardock has a lot of good direct vector moves, but much like Goku Black, he doesn't really have a great downward style attack that he can do in the air. He has good conversion stuff he can do once he's done attacks, but he generally won't want to be in the exact same space. Vegeta has multiple moves that make this a very powerful technique for him. He can convert easily off super dashes without working too hard for this. And he can actually respace himself in the air and decide to not do the super dash at all for a lot of situations. This is true in both of Vegeta's forms. It's just that Vegeta Blue is better at making it bigger damage, more or less. He also has moves that have built-in super dash properties, meaning that against a team that is spamming the Action 5 down S stuff, he's not as likely to be hurt. But a lot of what you can see in the training is opponents that approach you with various forms of their specials, and your super dash ends up correcting direction and timing so that you get right under, they get right under you and you get to confirm something. So this is kind of a strange position to be in. And you can see as you go through, if your intention was to do the longer same style combos that you normally do, sometimes you find it not quite working as you'd expect. Note, for example, that specifically timing is also thrown off very slightly. So even though it's required in order to get the points that your combo be more than 2 hits, you can't just do super dash into a single hit move. And technically, you should count a special move as 1 hit if it's the first thing you do. Let's put it that way. You may find that your timing is off, your spacing is off, other small things that you'd expect to be the same change relatively quickly, because it matters so much more at which point you made contact with the opponent with your super dash. Similarly, if you get caught up in it, but your opponent actually manages to block, you have to be relatively aware of this because you're much more likely to be unsafe in a way that is not so normal for you. Most of us have good, relatively known mix-ups for managing to hit a crouch blocking opponent with a super dash. But it's a lot harder in situations where you've hit a blocking opponent, but that blocking opponent was in the air. So you can, as mentioned, see the Bardock problem. It's easier to feel uncomfortable in the air with this character, even though he's not that different from Adult Gohan in most other ways. In fact, Adult Gohan would have more or less the same problems, except that he can convert into things like legs and can just do elbow instead of any of this whenever he wants. Bardock can do something like it, but it's not as simplistic. In this case, therefore, you have a slightly higher chance of being clipped while you are trying to get into position, by the blast from, let's say, Goku's standing special. But since this blast would be deflected easily by a super dash, once you actually manage to get into the air, it's reasonably easy to just super dash immediately. And therefore it's mainly a deterrent from going into the air and wiggling around while far away from the enemy. because you might get clipped. But again, for the most part, not super worth it, so let's turn it back off and continue the training in the regular way. Once Action 5 is back off, even using this team, you will start to see some difference in difficulty in approaching. They have a bit more time on their hands, you could say, to do other things. The important thing to pay attention to, success or failure, is precisely why you have succeeded or failed. The number of combos that will end up getting dropped or positions where the opponent drops out of your expectation is likely to increase quite a lot in this form of training versus opponents who are just on the ground. There are certain recovery situations in which Super Dash is one of your literal best options, because the vector you will end up approaching your opponent from is practically indefensible outright. There's nearly no button they could hit, and nearly no reaction they could have that would solve it. This is because crouch heavy, or rather 2H, let's say, is often a different style of attack for many characters when they're in the air than when they're on the ground, and for most characters it's not as effective. This is not to say there are no characters for whom this move is equally effective, it's just that there are very few of them. And most of the time these are not characters you want to be super dashing in on anyway, specifically like Android 18, Adult Gohan, and similar. Since this is more of an offensive style of bot form, it's not really approach, because you're not intending to use the super dash as just an approach. It's not really a way to get in that you're leveraging, really. It is absolutely something you are supposed to hit with, and once you do, the question is, how much can you get out of it? But this is no use if you don't have the DLC character available to make it perfect. So let's switch to Goku Black in base Goku's space, so you can see what the outcome of that is. There are multiple reasons why this is less effective for this training. But after working with Android 16 and checking the main reasons why this is or is not effective, we decided to not go with 16 as the main one that we would be suggesting to use in place of base Goku, and have Black take the position instead. When using Goku Black, you specifically need Action 5 to be off. So those of you who don't have DLC are just slightly more limited and just should never have Action 5 on for this period. The primary reason for this is that while he does actually have some really good stuff he throws out for this, dodging those things and then using your Super Dash is relatively easy and tends to offset the flow entirely. So once again, let's go through our points system. Your aim is to change character, use the Switch style Super Dash, and you can do that at any time. When you've done that, land a combo, you're good. The bot will block much less than a standard opponent would, but this is not really the point there. The point is more so to recognize the amount of things that can change between the time you want to do that move, the time you were able to do that move due to trying to wait on your assist timer, and when you actually have the move come out. And once again, remember, once you land this, you must land a combo with basically more than 2 hits. If you must use a special immediately, then at least make sure that you use a special that you can follow up in some way. Similarly, you are allowed to get points for any Super Dash that hits an aerial opponent. You can Super Dash from the ground and hit an aerial opponent if you want. If you have that sort of reaction, then by all means do it. Those are the 2 main things you're thinking of. Beyond that, you can also get points for Super Dashes that you do from the air yourself, but specifically when the Super Dash is done from the air, you need to be able to combo it into something. Specifically, you're looking for a level 3, a Vanish, or a Dragon Rush, if you can somehow set up a Dragon Rush. And you generally don't want the combo to be too long, but the reason for this restriction is to make you very aware of how many things you normally can land that might change in some way because of this. You can just remember it this way: if you come from the air with your Super Dash and just do your standard combo, this is not a point. Your opponent would have had to go into the air, and noticeably so, in order for it to count, while you were on your way in. So your little 4-hit, drop people to the ground, those things, those do not count. For the part of this that gets points for coming in from the air with your Super Dash, you want to Vanish, Dragon Rush, or go for level 3 Super. Usually, of course, you want to do the level 3 Super when your opponent has enough health, but you can just throw them out afterwards with the Dragon Rush. in the main page when this is released, those will be counted as two separate things. And the reason this will be so is basically due to difficulty stuff, and because it affects different characters in different ways, so we need to be able to change the two separately. This is definitely more so offense and accuracy though, recognizing when you are not in the position you think you are in, or when your opponent is not in the position you think they're in, and your combo for whatever reason therefore drops. Or that the timing of your combo has changed, and you're not able to just go, okay, here's the way to do this, and then banish here, and then do that, and I'm fine now. This can be an easy way to get into a lot of trouble in this game. To learn the skills around this and yet not be able to adapt super quickly on the confirm of the super dash hitting. But let's go back to talking about Goku Black a bit. He's not as helpful as base Goku because he moves a lot more. And while that is also true of Super Saiyan Goku, he has a specific role in this group test that Goku Black's abilities don't generally set up. Goku Black is much more likely to just spam a certain move and approach you, and to knock you out of the air. This is good if you are the sort of person who isn't used to this concept of this being hard. Goku Black might be the better person to start with if your initial thought is, this sounds really easy, I don't have to do much of anything. As he's the most likely of the three characters to actually manage to just hit you. And to do so without making himself particularly vulnerable to anything. He also affords a second beam style assist to Tenshinhan and other Gokus. However, he misses out on that double-sided guard style assist that you get from base Goku, which actually kind of matters depending on how you approach the Super Dash part of this. So just for clarity, I mentioned this as an additional point, and the reason it was considered additional is that if you hit an opponent who went airborne with your super dash that you started from the air and managed to do your conversion into Dragon Rush or Vanish after a combo or level 3 super, then you will gain 2 points for doing this. This is extra rewarded because the amount of awareness required to do this properly is basically about twice as much. Part of the reason why it's important to be able to land multiple hits in these combos, even though it's not really that big a deal otherwise, is meter gain. Just doing a special out of this can gain you some meter, but it's often so little damage from the super dash attack that your primary benefit from doing this against an opponent who is aware is that you gain meter for doing it. Therefore, the more hits you can sneak in successfully and carefully, most of the time, the more meter you will gain. Goku Black also tends to cause problems with this. As he has many more ways of limiting this situation. Fortunately, at least on this version of it, your bot may be different. You can reference the main bot page for some input on this. Depending on which assist button you use, you might want to change around the order, but the point is to have Goku, Base Goku, or Goku Black generally not be the one that gets switched in. We want the workhorses of this form of the bot to be Tenshinhan and Super Saiyan Goku. But as this is a little different from where we started, just for contrast, we're going to return to the original team, but leave Goku Black on the bot side. Characters with a high ability to attack laterally out of their own recovery in the air make certain forms of air judgment more difficult, and specifically make it more necessary that you manage to finish your combos in some way once you are actually hitting an airborne opponent with the Super Dash and proceeding from there. So for proper contrast, we're going to leave Action 5 off once again, so that we're back to where we started, but with a different character. It is in fact absolutely fine to just get as many points as you want or can by just waiting it out and using your change in order to get stuff. This is of course the easiest form of the bot, and eventually one would have a slight difficulty change relative to that, but there's a specific reason why it is just flatly okay and allowed to do it that way. One does generally want to be able and willing to just switch whenever you can and get stuff off of it. Until the game is changed in some way, this is a really powerful technique. and being willing to do it in relatively neutral situations is among the things more likely to take opponents by surprise than most. Obviously, if you feel as if your opponent is just standing there waiting for you to do this so that they can hit you with 2H, you don't want to do it then, but it is a powerful thing in neutral. It's also relatively easy to stop with correct timing from nearly anything because you can't do anything about it, and it's the most linear super dash possible. If you're doing it from the ground anyway. What is more important, however, is to consider that the lower the health gets on any given one of your characters, the more dangerous this becomes to do as a whole. In other words, you will learn at least a bit to plan whether or not this is a good idea based on whether or not the character you want to bring in has enough health to make it worth your while. And while this bot is generally not going to be too damaging, it is made up of some of the more damaging characters in the game for the most part. They may randomly do or not do a lot of damage, but it does make you think about it. However, there is one other way to change the difficulty a little bit. If you want to practice that but still feel as if it's quote-unquote too easy. Since the bot often uses a lot of specials, it quickly runs out of meter. And since it often doesn't do too many supers, you don't specifically have to worry about constant super spam. If it could spam them constantly, it just would. Meaning that your option is simply to raise the key gauge of the bot to either 2 or 3. I suggest 2 because 3 gets a little bit nuts. But 3 is still functional, and it does lead to 1 or 2 things because of the level 3s these characters have available to them. So you can consider that a straight up difficulty increase at your leisure. Now again, they're not that likely to use supers or spam them at all. But if you are starting to find it too easy to do, or the approach you've taken makes it easy for whatever reason, and you feel as if you just need to be feeling more threatened in order to get your proper training in, then yes, some higher meter can definitely help out here. It should not convert that often, as they're not really the type who land a lot of supers randomly out of nowhere. But when they do land them, it's more likely that they'll hurt quite a lot. This in turn adds to your stress in terms of just using your Z change as your main method for this, and similar, as well as giving them the option to shift out of things themselves. The other reason this is slightly more helpful is that they will often respace themselves relative to you by using these supers. And that alone can be enough to make it feel more difficult. As you can see, Goku Black tends to be... he tends to make it feel more like mix-ups are happening, which may not be what you want for the train. But similarly, if you find that that's something you really want to experience, then it is quite possible to do without base Goku in this. Again, not recommended as a base thing, but you should definitely modify this to whatever you consider most helpful to you. And then occasionally reset to the norm so that you can see what differences have been made, or just to have some slight mental strain on yourself. Variations are always good in reasons like that. The final reason why this helps, though I don't specifically consider it that helpful, is that there are certain repositioning style EX moves that can then be recovered out of by using supers. And this helps the bot shift around a bit more and make you less comfortable about just super dashing because, oh, their move is ending. So this particular stream is going to be much shorter for two reasons. And while I talk about that, let's switch back to base Goku once more. And you can continue to watch demonstration in the background. The first is, as mentioned yesterday, we don't have another form of the bot to preview at this time. At least none that is confirmed to be helpful or working with specific characters or people. There are a couple things set up for like teams of entire DLC, but those aren't really that useful to most people. And we'll of course develop those later for more niche things, but as we've mentioned, if you want to just experience various characters, you should be able to probably extrapolate based on the characters' play styles or the synergy of whatever team, which of the things you should be doing and focused on, and just apply the equivalent bot. We may also have some that eventually do more changes to any given input, probably the ubiquitous Action 5, but it could also be Action 8, depending. But these would of course both take more development and require more testing, and are not as likely to be demonstrated at the end of a stream, even in preview form like this one. other reason, of course, being that since this is a relatively simpler bot, there's not as much to talk about or demonstrate, and it specifically has a lessened factor of damage, as well as lessened flashiness, more or less. The characters are more simplistic, they do less supers, and generally, your aims are more simplistic. So with much less variations to cover, and much less movement to worry about, we just have a shorter stream tonight. The final point of mention, therefore, is that there is one more character type who deals with this differently. So we will, as always, have Gotenks come on in to show off some of his specific skills in this situation before we close out. I would say characters like Gotenks, but there's really no character quite like Gotenks. Gotenks does what he wants when he wants to, at least in terms of targeting his moves at other characters. His level 3 confirms from long distances, even longer than Kid Buu, while in the air. And despite having short normals, he has a myriad of different attacks he can use to reposition himself in and out of danger at basically any time. Therefore, for Gotenks specifically, you will want to watch for a specific part of the changing movement of these characters. Gotenks can more or less confirm from anywhere, as rolling kick will more or less just hit. But you'll know that Gotenks tends to do relatively little damage for this. If you recognize that your character can always confirm, your aim should always be to learn that first, but as you improve more and more, to look for situations in which you can do more damage in some way, and learn to recognize those situations. This sort of thing is one of the hardest things to learn in fighting games. Basically, improvement by optimization. And Gotenks is a character who requires a lot of this. There are a few others that require large amounts of optimization in order to set up these situations for you. But you should always remember it based on Gotenks, so that if you do not know if a character is like that, you have a benchmark. Gotenks is as good as it gets. The least possible effort and thinking required to actually manage combos in that situation. That said, therefore, our bot will be up on our website 2-mk.org at around 6 or 7 Eastern, somewhere in between there, on Sunday. Our streams will be up next week as usual. On Monday we'll be having our Mishmashing Battle Lounge for Street Fighter V. And on Tuesday, the Tuesday train, Guilty Gear, beginner to intermediate East Coast lobby. On Wednesday we'll be going back into Sandbag Casuals again for Street Fighter V. The first session since the quote-unquote lag change. And on Thursday, some more Kame House, showing off what we have or have not learned from whatever time we've had with bots. Next week, therefore, it's super unlikely that we will have any disc guidance for a bot on Friday, as we will still be doing development, and therefore we will probably go back to our Dead or Alive 5 last round lobby. So you can join us for that as well. If you want any other information about streams, bot release timings, or so on, you can follow us at 2_MK_FGC on Twitter. And if you have any questions, you can send them through our contact page on the website 2-mk.org. And we'll generally respond to those emails quite quickly. Therefore, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Enjoy your weekend, train well. Good night, everyone.